Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's always a great pleasure and an honor to come to the humanist community of Silicon Valley and speak to you today about something that has probably been on many people's minds for many years is about U.S. sanctions. And let's see. So, as most of you know, the United States has been waging war against various perceived enemies ever since the end of the Second World War, and the United States is the one that has taken the initiative to launch these attacks, invasions, occupations, particularly in the Middle East. A lot of regime changes in Latin America, and basically the basing of U.S. troops around the world in something like 700 military bases. There's no other country that comes close to what the United States has done in terms of projecting its military power beyond its borders. But there's another aspect to the role of the United States as the world's superpower, and that is the projection of this power through non-military means. And yes, the world's sole superpower today has diplomatic power through the State Department, through the kind of influence that it has at the United Nations, through the fact that the main multilateral lending agencies like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The United States has an outsized voting power in these institutions. So it has this kind of sort of soft influence. But something that has come into increasing usage in recent years is the use of sanctions. And sanctions, embargoes, using economic leverage to put pressure and even impose damage on the economies of countries that it doesn't like, governments that it deems to be unfriendly, countries that have been designated for regime change, of course, these governments should be, as we understand it, as is understood in the United Nations, should be the choice of the people of that country. But our government seeks to impose its will on many of these countries because of various reasons. And we'll go through those. So why are sanctions being used? And it's true, the United States is not the only country that imposes sanctions, but the United States is the primary user of sanctions. So whenever the United Nations imposes sanctions, it is very often, it's almost always the United States that takes the lead in imposing these sanctions through the United Nations. So the reasons for sanctions are often, let me do this. Will that work? The reason that sanctions are used is as a punishment for countries that have seized private assets. Cuba is one of the big examples there. So after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the Cuban government, because it was a socialist government, seized the properties of private citizens, and in particular the properties that were owned by U.S. multinational corporations, the sugar companies, that were in Cuba, and so these like plantations that were owned by U.S. companies became state farms. Just because countries are socialist, so you take it like North Korea, China was for many years under what was called U.S. containment policy, and containment was another form of sanctions. The Soviet Union, there were limitations, there were restrictions on trade and investment with the former Soviet Union, and the list goes on. More recently, there's sanctions have been used against countries that have defied the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is not exactly an anti-nuclear treaty. It is about privilege. It's about the privilege of the P5, that is to say the five nuclear powers at the time that the treaty was signed, which are also happen to be the five permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the U.S., Russia, China, Britain, and France. And then any other country that comes along after that is prohibited under that treaty from developing nuclear weapons. Now, several countries like India, Israel, did not sign that treaty, and so they're technically not in violation of the treaty, but they've gone ahead to develop their nuclear weapons and have come under mild sanctions. I mean, Israel is an exception. It has never come under U.S. sanctions, despite the fact that it has developed nuclear weapons. A failure to accept international capitalist rules, so any country that refuses to adopt market policies may come under sanctions. Refuses to accept, opening their markets to stock exchanges and foreign investment. Alleged human rights violations. We have to understand how human rights are used, in particular by the U.S. government. So every year, the State Department publishes a thick volume that is a report to the President on human rights around the world. And this volume it details what the State Department knows about human rights in various countries. Of course, it's according to their criteria, but it's a reasonable document in that it doesn't discriminate against one country or another. But the administration, that is to say the President and the rest of the executive branch, can pick and choose what they want to use out of that report. And in practice, what they actually use is that they pick those countries that they want to target, that they want to put pressure on, or that they want to invoke regime change, and those are the ones where the U.S. government talks about human rights abuses. So, for example, Saudi Arabia is a country that the U.S. the U.S. government does not want to change, despite the fact that it has some of the worst human rights abuses of any country in the world, so it's a very selective usage of human rights. Alleged state sponsorship of terrorism. So again, it's up to U.S. agencies to define what country is a state sponsor of terrorism. And so it's selectively used, for example, against Iran, even though a lot of the actions of the Iranian government are in support of legitimate organizations such as Hezbollah. Whether you agree with Hezbollah politically or not, the point is that Hezbollah is a legitimate political party with a militia attached to it in Lebanon, and is part of the governing the sort of the ruling coalition in the Lebanese parliament. And then, of course, regime change, which is I've already spoken to that. So these are some of the reasons why sanctions have been imposed. There are also justifications for war, but sanctions have been used more and more because the American public has become increasingly fed up with overseas wars, and now, you know, there still are U.S. troops in Afghanistan. This is the longest, by far the longest war that the United States has ever been involved in. So why is the United States the leading sanctioner? I mean, why don't other countries use sanctions as a means of you know, imposing their will on other countries in the world? Well, one is because the United States today is the world's sole superpower. Now, even in the days of the Soviet Union, so before 1991, the Soviet Union was also considered to be a superpower. The problem is that the Soviet Union never had a huge economy. I mean, in real terms. I mean, it was at the official dollar-ruble exchange rate, it had the second largest economy, but the reality is that it was sort of a hollow shell. And so the Soviet Union didn't have the economic clout to impose those sanctions. And we'll get into the reasons why the size of the economy is important. And as the sole superpower today, the U.S. has taken on the role of the global enforcer, the global policeman, if you will, and that's why it uses sanctions. Thirdly, there's the extraterritorial application of U.S. law. So what this means is that, you know, most countries pass laws, and those laws apply to what happens within their country, within their borders. The United States doesn't do that. The United States is the only country, for example, that passes a tax law and says that tax law applies to the worldwide income of any U.S. citizen or U.S. resident. No other country does that. However, it exempts U.S. corporations from that, right? Because U.S. corporations are not subject to U.S. tax on their global income, only their U.S. income. So it's discriminatory. Dollar transactions. So some of the basis for U.S. sanctions is the U.S. Justice Department's assertion of the right of the jurisdiction over any kind of transaction in the world that involves U.S. dollars. So in other words, if there's a U.S. dollar transaction that the Justice Department doesn't like, it can take that, you know, the parties that are involved in that to court, or it can simply impose a fine on those parties. U.S. content. So there, you know, because of the size of the U.S. economy, a lot of products that are bought and sold in the world have U.S. content. Not necessarily U.S. parts. It could be U.S. intellectual property rights. If there's a U.S. patent in a device, it could come it could be subject to sanctioning. And then just the political power that I talked about at multilateral agencies. And so the fact that the U.S. has the world's largest economy means that what ordinarily happens when the United States decides to sanction another country is that the U.S. economy loses a certain amount of economic opportunities through trading, through investment, through mutual economic exchanges with that other country. But for the U.S. economy, which is 21 trillion, it's almost nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. So it doesn't harm the U.S. economy. But the other country that is being sanctioned suffers an economic hit that is comparable to what the U.S. economy suffered. But because those economies are much smaller, see, this area of overlap is the commonality between the two economies, right? And so what Cuba loses through an embargo that has been enforced ever since 1962 is huge to the Cuban economy. Less so in the case of Iran, because Iran has trade with other countries in Asia, with the DPRK, that is North Korea, It's very small, because the North Korean trade is primarily, or was primarily, with other Asian countries like China and potentially the South Korea. I know you can't read this, but this is just sort of a timeline of Iran's of the embargoes, blacklists, and other actions against Iran. Almost all of them initiated by the United States, and so this goes back as far as the Islamic Revolution in 1979 to the present. And what we hear about in the news is this constant ramping up of sanctions. The U.S. imposes new sanctions on Iran. I never hear much about reversing of the sanctions, except in 2015 when the Iran nuclear deal was signed. And so at that point, through the United Nations and with the JCPOA, that is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that is the official name of the Iran nuclear deal, the sanctions were rescinded. And then last year, or not, 2 years ago now, 2018, summer of 2018, the Trump administration unilaterally pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed U.S. sanctions, U.S. unilateral sanctions. The European powers that initiated the Iran nuclear deal said no, and however, they have found that they have very limited power to counter the U.S. sanctions or to provide replacement trade with Iran that would compensate for the U.S. sanctions. We'll get more into that. Yes. With a mic, can you wait for the microphone?
We prefer that you not ask questions during the talk, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. To the next slide. This slide. So my question is about what we're looking at here. We're looking at the production of oil by Iran against the timeline.
Yes. So so the curve, the actual curve is Iranian oil production, and how it was affected by various sanction actions, right?
Okay, so then the understanding is when there's sanctions against Iran, their oil production will go down because people are not buying the oil?
It could. It could. I mean, in this case, there are a lot of cases where sanctions were imposed that were not on oil, the oil trade, and so the oil trade was not necessarily affected in a negative way. Now, of course, with the most recent reimposition of U.S. sanctions, the most severe impact actually has been the 2018 reimposition of U.S. sanctions on Iran, which included the oil trade. This is the first time that the U.S. has said that other countries in Asia, like India and China, which are some of the big buyers of Pakistan, big buyers of Iranian oil, that even they cannot purchase oil. So this is the first time that Iran's oil production has plummeted from 2.8 million barrels per day to about 500,000 barrels per day, which is not on this chart. Yeah, I'd like to maybe request that we avoid asking questions during the talk, otherwise I won't get through it. Again, these are just, I don't want to go through the details because I really don't have the time, but this is sort of a timeline of many of the sanctions and embargoes that have been imposed on Iran over time. And just to emphasize that the sanctions, the ramping up of the sanctions is going on just last month. So we're talking about just within the last month, there was the imposition of new sanctions on Mahan Air, which is one of the Iranian airlines, new sanctions on one of the Iranian shipping companies, allegedly for being involved in the shipment of parts that could be used in the Iranian missile program. Okay, I have too much detail here, so I'm going to skip that. So I want to talk just a little bit about the Iran nuclear deal, just to show you, just to give you an example of how the news that we get in this country is manipulated. So we know about the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that was the Iran nuclear deal. In this country, you've always heard about the parties that were in the negotiations for the JCPOA back in 2015, and they are the P5+1. The P5 being the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and one, the +1 is Germany. It always seemed curious to me, why was Germany included in those negotiations, because it hasn't been included in other negotiations that involve the P5. And it turns out that the reason that Germany was included is because it was one of the 3 initiators of the negotiations. So the actual initiation was done by the E3. So the E3 are the 3 European powers, Britain, France, and Germany. So if you actually read the JCPOA, very few people do, but if you actually read the JCPOA, it says that the negotiating parties are the E3/EU, which is the European Union, +3. So they are the initiators. The +3 are the US, Russia, and China. So that's what the rest of the world knows about. But the US media, the US government changes that around to the P5+1. Okay, I won't go over that because I don't have as much time for this talk as I did the other talks that I've done. So we've already talked about the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. I just want to mention very quickly that when that happened, Iran did not do anything. It did not ramp up its nuclear program for a year. And in the summer of last year, it started to say, okay, we're going to breach the limits of the treaty. But the breaches of the treaty it's a very interesting sort of dog whistling between the nuclear powers, because what they did is the treaty limits nuclear enrichment to 3.66% of fissionable uranium-235 and the rest of it is non-fissionable uranium-238, and that limit comes from something that nobody tells you about, which is the 5% threshold. So my brother-in-law is with the Indian nuclear program. That's how I know this. And so the 5% threshold is the point where you encounter resistance in the enrichment process, and you have to improve your technology to get past 5%. So the JCPOA limits it to 3.66. And so what the Iranians have done is they breached that limit by going to 4.5. And so that's saying that, yes, we breached the limit, but we're still under the threshold. So this is the kind of games that are going on. So it's really innocuous, and that's why the E3 have said, we're going to stick to the JCPOA. We're going to still try to bypass U.S. sanctions. Another country that has long been a target of U.S. sanctions, of course, is North Korea. And North Korea, despite those sanctions, has developed its nuclear weapons. And this is again a timeline that I really don't have time to go through all the details of the actions, the missile and nuclear developments of North Korea, and the sanctions that were imposed in response to those developments. But let us say that it's a similar course where the United States has ramped up those sanctions and also insisted that China, which is North Korea's main trading partner, impose increasing sanctions on North Korea. Despite that, I mean, if you look at the whole history, I mean, ever since North Korea was founded in 1948, basically, the United States has had a containment policy on North Korea, has refused to recognize the government, and so has kept North Korea in isolation. The notion that North Korea is the hermit kingdom actually doesn't originate with North Korea. It actually comes from the imperial past. So before Korea was occupied by Japan in 1910, the dynasties, the imperial rulers in Korea had imposed their own isolation, and it's also geographical because North Korea, the two Koreas, are on a peninsula, and the only thing joining the Koreas to the rest of Asia is the Tumen River or the Yalu River, and it's very mountainous there. So there was in old times it was very difficult to cross that mountain range, and so the Hermit Kingdom was from that period of time. And today it's mostly because of U.S. containment. I mean, North Korea would love to trade with the rest of the world. Okay. So in October of last year, of 2018, the foreign minister of the Republic of Korea, that's the South, was considering lifting of some of its domestic sanctions against North Korea in order to resume inter-Korean economic projects. I mean, most notable of these is the Kaesong industrial complex, where 52 South Korean companies had built factories employing North Korean labor. This is about 10 kilometers north of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Mr. Trump said in response, "No, they will not do that without our approval. They do nothing without our approval." But that's the attitude of our government, and this is independent of who's president, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. It's just more irrational, more erratic under Mr. Trump. Okay, so this is I just put this here because what this shows is anything that's in green, that's above the line. This comes from two of the UN nuclear inspectors, Siegfried Hecker and Robert Carlin. And what they're showing here is that anything that's above the line that's in green is something that's positive in terms of U.S. diplomacy. So when the U.S. extended peace overtures to North Korea or agreed to talk, that's positive. It's shown in green, and then you have below that, in the lower line, is how the North Koreans responded to that. And so if it's in green, then it's a positive response. And then if it's red, that means that the U.S. was saber-rattling, it was imposing new sanctions, it was ramping up the rhetoric, and in the lower line is how the North Koreans responded to that. And so what you can see is that there's a correspondence between how the U.S. acts towards North Korea versus how the North Koreans react. So when we are peaceful, they are peaceful. When we say, we're going to conduct more military exercises, then they start launching missiles. So if we want to de-escalate the situation in the Korean Peninsula, we need to talk, we need to de-escalate, we need to offer peace and offer recognition. There's more of it, so there's a lot more data here. Russia. So Russia is something fairly recent in terms of the modern day sanctions, And these really began in 2014 after Russia invaded Crimea and seized the Crimean Peninsula. And the use of so once again, the use of sanctions here is to try to pressure Russia to reverse its course. And but there are some things that need to be understood in context. I'm not defending Russia's actions, but I'm just saying that for Russia, as a former global power, and still in some ways it still is a global power militarily, to be cut off from its naval base. What's key for Russia is the Sevastopol naval base. And why Sevastopol is so important is that for a maybe I should say a semi-global military power, it's an existential issue, because that's the only naval base that is in warm waters. Okay, the Leningrad is frozen in the winter. Vladivostok is too far away, and so it only has Sevastopol, and that's why it was important strategically for Russia to control that. Not defending their position, but that's how they look at it. And that's also the significance of the naval base at Latakia in Syria, is that that's the only other warm water port that they have. So the Russian response to the sanctions was to accelerate its de-dollarization of their economy. And actually other countries have started doing this. There are concerted efforts by European countries to begin to de-dollarize, because, as I mentioned earlier, because the Justice Department says that, okay, we have jurisdiction over any kind of dollar transactions in the world. The Russian Central Bank has slashed its treasury holdings, U.S. Treasury bond holdings, from 96 billion to 8 billion over a period of a little over a year, and so on. The sovereign wealth funds are cutting their U.S. dollar holdings and so forth. So that is the response, which means that over time the U.S. sanctions will gradually lose their bite, which I think in this world it's a good thing. It's a good thing if we have a more democratic global economy, in the sense that that there is a greater amount of equality between the major currencies. Cuba, I mentioned about how the embargo has been in place since 1962, and has been gone up and down depending on the politics in this country. But even under Bush, it reached its peak, the second Bush, and that was a time when the travel restrictions were at their peak, and you could, as a U.S. citizen, one could be put in jail for 10 years and fined $50,000 for simply traveling to Cuba without a license. That was the time I went, by the way. and then to one of the low points in the sanctions was under Obama, when the diplomatic recognition was extended to Cuba, and trade. Well, it was opened up to all kinds of tourism, even the cruise ships. Cruise ships, every day there would be U.S. cruise ships coming into various Cuban ports. And that has been largely reversed. We still have the diplomatic relations, but the cruise ships, a lot of the flights to airports other than Havana have been cut by the Trump administration. So the Cuban economy once again suffers because of this loss of tourism. Yeah. So this has been an ongoing thing, and Congress, the Democrats have not been much better in Congress on the the maintenance of these sanctions and embargoes. It is, so the U.S. policy towards Cuba has involved a trade and investment embargo, the travel ban, restricting airlines, airline travel, communications. So, for example, if you have, if you're on your mobile phone, you travel, you can roam almost anywhere in the world, right? Through a local phone company. You cannot do that in North Korea. You cannot do that in Cuba. So, when I take my phone to these countries, I don't have any communications. Sanctions, a ban on U.S. content, U.S. dollar transactions. So, for example, if you have a credit card, you can use your credit card anywhere in the world, but it won't work in North Korea. It won't work in Cuba. Europeans can use their credit cards in Cuba. Canadians can use their credit cards in Cuba, but not an American from a U.S. bank. The other thing is that the world capitalist market. The world capitalist market devalues the currency of any country that does not follow capitalist rules. And so this is what happens. The reason that the Cuban economy looks so poor to us, and when you go there with a dollar, and you convert that dollar into a convertible Cuban peso, right? And it buys you a reasonable amount of things. Now, if you were to go and into a local market where the local Cuban citizens buy things and present your convertible Cuban peso, you will get change in Cuban pesos. So you're going to get change back at the rate of 24 Cuban pesos to one convertible peso, which is close to $1. And this, so you can buy a whole bowl of basket of fruit for $1. And so what that is basically the world capitalist market devalues these currencies. It did that to Venezuela. So the bolivar is worthless because it has no value in world capitalist markets. The sanctions against Venezuela have impacted Cuba because Cuba used to get subsidized oil from Venezuela. That's been cut off. And so the only replacement now is Rosneft. So Rosneft, the Russian oil company, is now supplying fuel to Cuba. Now, just to understand the global context about how the rest of the world feels about this, the United Nations General Assembly every year has a vote calling on the United States to end its embargo on Cuba. And every year the vote is extremely lopsided. The one at the end of last year, in November, was 187 to end the U.S. embargo. 3 countries voted in favor, so that's the U.S., Israel, and one other. And I think this time it was Brazil. But usually it's one of those South Pacific islands that owe their economies to the U.S. So this is sort of a big. I know you can't read it. This is a sort of a summary of the global sanctions regimes. The main sanctioners are the United Nations, the European Union, and the United States. And the reason that it is these 3 is because the European Union has a consolidated economy that is comparable to the U.S., so it's a big economy. The United States, of course, because it is the superpower, and the United Nations, because that's a collective action where if the United States can impose its will, then it's a collective action of many members of the United Nations. So there's a lot of overlap between these various sanctions regimes, and some of them you can see, like North Korea and Iran are in that intersection of the three sanctions regimes. And this is sort of just to give you an idea that U.S. sanctions have been applied to many countries and entities over time, and the Cuba is the longest because it begins in 1961 and goes all the way to the present, and has been, as you can see, if we look at today, we see that there are a lot more countries that are subject to U.S. sanctions regimes than ever before. So it's something that the Obama administration, the Trump administration in particular, have used with increasing frequency. In terms of enforcement, so U.S. enforces sanctions through fines that include some of the highest that have ever been imposed by an enforcement agency anywhere in the world. The largest fine that was ever imposed by the U.S. government, or any government, was the fine against BNP Paribas, that is the Banque Nationale de Paris, and that was the fine was $8.9 billion for UN sanctions violations. Violations of specifically U.S. sanctions on Iran, and none of the fines that were imposed on banks as a result of the 2008 financial crisis came anywhere close to that. How is it done? So how do sanctions work? So basically. There are several ways that sanctions work through the financial system in terms of blocking financial transactions. One of them is through SWIFT. So SWIFT is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It's based in Europe, and basically any kind of an international financial transaction between two countries has to go through SWIFT. The money doesn't actually go through SWIFT. SWIFT is a communications nexus, and before the transaction is done, two banks communicate through SWIFT that, okay, we have an intent to electronically transfer to you X number of dollars or euros or whatever, and so it's a redundancy in the communication between banks, that where there's a verification, there's a handshake that this amount of money is going to be transferred. Do you verify it? Do you confirm receipt of this message? Do you confirm that you're ready to receive this money? And so and the U.S. imposes imposes its jurisdiction on SWIFT, even though it's based in Europe. That SWIFT cannot be involved in any kind of transactions with Iran or North Korea. So in the case of Iran, because the European powers do not accept the U.S. sanctions, and there are no UN sanctions, they have sought to go around SWIFT. And so one of the things that they've tried to do is to create another agency called INSTEX, as a way of operating in parallel with SWIFT and other interbank transfers. But it hasn't been used very much because companies are reluctant to, just simply are reluctant to violate U.S. sanctions, even though there's a channel provided by the Europeans for financial transactions with Iran or Iranian entities. Why does the U.S. in particular have so much power? And one of them is because of the predominance of the U.S. dollar in the global economy. And so the reserves that all countries hold in terms of foreign exchange is 62%. 62% of those international reserves are held in U.S. dollars. And others, like the euro, are far behind. The Chinese renminbi, even the Japanese yen are very small by comparison. So once again, this is the allocated reserves, dollar share. It fluctuates over time, but it's pretty much near to 65% of global reserves. Now, what's even more telling is you know, the most highly traded commodity in the world is currency. When you go out and you go to another country, you exchange dollars for the currency of that country, you are doing a foreign exchange transaction. So every day, the amount of currency that is exchanged is 5 trillion. 5 trillion, right? So 5 trillion is a quarter of the US economy every day. It's the most highly traded commodity in the world. Of those transactions, of those 5 trillion per day transactions, 88% involve the US dollar on one side or the other of the transaction. That's how dominant the US dollar is in tourism and world trade. So, as I mentioned, when you have that, and then the U.S. Justice Department saying that, okay, we have jurisdiction, so any kind of foreign exchange transaction that involves the dollar, potentially the Justice Department could say, okay, we're going to fine you for transacting those dollars, even if you did it in China or you did it inside Kazakhstan. Another reason why the world uses the dollar is because it is so dominant. Is that okay? So this is, I took this photo in Dubai, and this is an exchange, a currency exchange, and these are the rates, and what they have is the buy rate and the sell rate for foreign currencies into Emirati dinars. And what's important is the spread between these two. So I take the numbers, the buy rates and the sell rates, take their difference, and express it as a percentage. So in other words, the numbers that you see here are spreads. So this is the amount that you're charged between the buying and the selling rate for that transaction. And so countries like India, 18% is what you're being charged if you buy and then sell back. And even euros, you're paying almost 6%, so 3% on each side. And only in the case of the US dollar, it's 1.2%, 1.23%. Okay, so that's 0.6% on the buy and 0.6 on the sell. And that's why people use dollars, because it's cheaper to use dollars. So the global response, as I mentioned, there are moves by many other countries, including many of our allies, to circumvent sanctions, circumvent the power of the dollar by de-dollarizing, and then creating, alternative mechanisms for doing transfers, for doing trade, so that's the situation in the world today, and these are some of the. I was in Iraq a little while ago, and this is the border with Iran. And you see, these are the tankers that were used to move oil across the border from Iran into Iraq during the time when there were sanctions on Iranian oil. This is some of the trade, how goods go in and out of Iran through intermediate ports. This is Dubai, moving directly from ships to trucks without any kind of inspections. And then this is how countries suffer under sanctions, but in North Korea, the priority is is children. So this is a school. So this is despite the sanctions. North Korea puts its resources into schools and infrastructure for its people, and it's very totalitarian, but this is what they at least do for their people. And the biggest building in any village is a school. So that's all I have for sanctions, and now we'll open it up for questions. And please.
I would like to give another opinion. I was born in Iran. I lived 2 decades in Iran, and I studied in Europe and in US international relations. And as you know me, I am every day at the Stanford, and I hear every of those people, and I have been member of the leading group in Europe in liberal parties and so on. And the picture that you give about Iran, I can discuss about all of those things, but I'm just focusing on Iran because this is close to my experience and I'm following every day. I feel that the picture that you give to the people here, unfortunately, as is always in all media, that when people go from here, they see US as the biggest pain, and they don't see what is going inside of Iran. When you say that Hezbollah is illegitimate, I am talking about how Iran during 35 years. Yeah, but I want to give another perspective because I don't want that people go from here and think that Soleimani, who was killed, was a nice guy and so on. Soleimani and Iranian regime during 35 years put the whole region in the fire. Soleimani and Iranian regime is responsible for thousands of children in Yemen. Iranian regime, Iranian people suffering extremely, so much that they are talking that they don't want that Iran invest in all the warfare all over the region, from Afghanistan to Lebanon and everywhere.
We only have about 10 more minutes.
Yeah, we need to give
Yes.
time for other people to ask questions.
I feel that you give the perspective that is not correct about the Iran situation.
Okay, so let me...
My option is that US should not have done sanction against Iran, but they should have. This is the thing that liberal and Democrat always do, because they silence down anyone who says something. I am not pro-Trump, I hate Trump, but I have opinion about the things because I see what the liberal and Democrat is doing.
Okay. Yeah, so let me just say, so first, thank you for your opinion on that. I respect it. As far as my, view of Iran, I mean, I have great difficulty with, for example, the way that the Iranian government brutally suppressed the protest demonstration. I was at the protest demonstration here in solidarity with the Iranian people. And I was also at the demonstration against the U.S. bombing of General Soleimani. And so...
Soleimani,
yeah. Well, no, but the point is that, I mean, we could also argue that John Bolton is a killer. And then, but would we accept some other country coming and bombing John Bolton within our borders? So it's not an appropriate response under international law. Things like who started the conflict in Yemen. I mean, I would argue that it's Saudi Arabia that has done much more of the bombing in Saudi Arabia and killed more people. So I mean, we don't have time to debate these things here. But let's just say that I'm not supporting the government of Iran. I'm just saying that it is up to the Iranian people. What we want is the Iranian people to have the democratic right to determine their government. And the United States should not be intervening in ways that, in particular, that contravene international law.
When the Iranian regime killed...
No,
no more.
That's it.
We have to go.
All right, I have a-
Don't respond to her.
I have a question here. So what I'm trying to figure out here is the alternative, because let's take the case of North Korea, which is a very poor country. We have a whole entire aid charity industry that the U.S. encourages with poor countries. Like, for example,
Sure, please.
I am.
Okay.
I just got like through 1 or 2 sentences here. I'd like to finish the question. So in those countries, the U.S. actually brings in assistance, dumps the market, as you probably know, with cheap goods, which then prevents that country from producing their own goods and destroys their own economy. So that is not an alternative either. So I'm just trying to figure out where's the actual solution here, because I don't think an aid industry would be a solution for something like a North Korea, but then sanctions aren't either. So what are your thoughts on like a solution?
No, so the solution in case of North Korea is economic engagement and political engagement. First of all, we have to talk to them. We can't have the situation that since 1953, the end of the Korean War, we refused to talk to them. By bringing them into the world community of nations, they would, the North Koreans actually don't want nuclear weapons. The reason that they've developed nuclear weapons is because they have not been recognized, because they've been so systematically excluded from world institutions, from the world economy, and they're saying, hey, we exist, just recognize us. So there's a lot more that we could get into. So, for example, during the time when the Kaesong industrial complex was in operation, things were, the North Koreans were acting peacefully. They were not engaging in these kinds of military provocations. And in terms of development, actually, if you actually go to North Korea, which I did, it's not as bad as the picture that's painted here in this country, because the picture that's painted is people are starving. I didn't see any of that. That did happen back, in 1998. There was a famine, but not now. And so it's engagement. There's no reason to bring all of these people into the world economy.
Hi. As I recall, you were here a while back talking about Cuba, and there was a trip going to Cuba at that time. Were you involved with that? As I recall, from the Peace Center?
Well, no, the Peace Center didn't do it, but I made 2 trips to Cuba last year. And then there are organizations that do reality tours to Cuba, such as Global Exchange, Human Agenda. So if you're interested, we can talk about that afterwards.
So I was wondering, I see you travel to all the sanctioned countries. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, how is that funded? Who pays for that? How are you able to do that?
Well, I do it as an investigator. So I do research, I write about it, I speak about it, and it's my interest. I guess it's my lifelong interest to understand better what's happening in these countries, the impact of the sanctions. The money, my profession is medical research, and that's how I've, sometimes I do get people, or sometimes countries will say, okay, we'll give you a discount and that kind of thing. So that helps.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Besides the political power, what is the quantification of the financial advantage to the U.S. and also to the corporate America?
In sanctions, you mean? Are you talking about sanctions? No,
the sanctions, yeah. There should be some, not just the political, mm-hmm. but also the financial. And is there any quantification of U.S. from financial perspective? Like through sanction, U.S. has this kind of advantages, and also to big corporations.
Right. So the impact, the economic impact of U.S. sanctions on U.S. corporations, the U.S. economy, is twofold. One is that it's a negative impact in terms of lost economic activity, because if, in other words, many U.S. corporations, for example, are actually calling for the lifting of the U.S. embargo on Cuba because they're losing business by not being able to be in Cuba. European companies are there, Brazilian companies are there, Canadian companies are there, but the U.S. companies are losing out. And so there is that loss. The other aspect is what the capitalist system hopes to gain out of the sanctions, which is the regime change. If that's the hope, then yes, there might be a long-term down the road benefit if that government were to fall, and then open up the economy to investment, and then also the U.S. would say, okay, because you're now a capitalist country, we will open up, we will send our investments your way. So there are these two aspects.
So sanctions, according to your talk, are frequently used as a form of, almost as an extension of the U.S. military without any sort of fighting. But what my question is there seems to be situations where some sort of engagement is necessary for the safety of citizens and the safety of just the world's precarious situation with peace and nuclearization. What is an alternative to sanctions in order to exert a sort of will upon the world?
So the alternative to sanctions and the alternative to use of military force is diplomacy. It's about economic engagement. It's about development. So like for example, there's a lot of concern about, I don't know, well, let's just take an example, the violence in Central America. It impacts the U.S. because it's creating all these waves of undocumented migration, particularly of unaccompanied minors. But they're coming because of the violence. So how do we deal with it? I mean, we could sanction those countries. We haven't, but we could sanction them for not controlling migration, or we could deal with the violence, and the violence comes from the fact that they're part of the drug trade that flows into the United States, and the fact that all the arms that you see in Mexico actually flow across the border from the U.S. And it's about development. Is that why don't we spend the money that we are spending on military and use that for the development of the Central American countries? Why don't we use some of that to economically develop countries like Syria? I think that there are many alternatives to sanctions and to the use of military. Yes, military will still be needed in response to some kind of a very tangible threat of violence by some other party, but it would be much less than the deployment of military that we have today.
Okay, this is the last question. I'm sorry, folks. So some people took a long time.
So this one's really quick. In the Venn diagram that you showed Europe having sanctions against the U.S., and I'm wondering what that's about.
No, it's not Europe against the U.S. EU sanctions. Oh, okay. Yeah. So there are. It's first of all, it's very minor, but it's there are these trade wars, and a lot of it has to do with accusations of illegal government subsidies. So under the World Trade Organization rules, countries are not supposed to subsidize the products of private companies. and in some cases it's blurred because some of these companies are partially public sector companies, where it's very hard to actually quantify how much state support state-owned enterprises have. And so there are sanctions that are applied, very selectively against companies that are alleged to have state support that breaches WTO rules.